Chapter 1: The Quiet Man at the End of the Line. Ray Kitts had learned, over the years, how to stand in a room without becoming part of it. On the manufacturing floor, that skill served him well. The place was loud in every sense of the word. Machines thudding and whining, radios blaring classic rock stations that had long ago stopped feeling rebellious, men and women shouting commentary across aisles as if the noise were a challenge rather than a given. Gossip traveled faster than the forklifts. Stories inflated themselves by the time they reached the break room. Everybody knew everybody else's business, or at least claimed to. Everybody except Ray. He worked the far end of Line C, where the conveyor belts curved slightly and the lighting dimmed just enough to make the shadows feel earned. He stacked, checked, signed, and moved on. When someone needed a pallet dragged, Ray did it. When a crate jammed, Ray unjammed it. When a shift ran short and a supervisor looked around with quiet panic, Ray stayed without being asked. People noticed his work. They always had. What they noticed more, though, was the lack of anything else. Ray didn't linger in conversations. He didn't offer opinions unless asked directly. He listened with the patience of someone who had nowhere he needed to be emotionally. If someone joked, he smiled. If someone complained, he nodded. If someone tried to pull him into speculation about who was sleeping with whom or which supervisor was angling for a promotion, Ray found a reason to be elsewhere. It wasn't that he disliked people. He just didn't see the value in being known. He had learned the hard way that familiarity was an invitation. Let people in and they picked things up. They learned where to press. They learned what you expected. An expectation, Ray had discovered, was a liability. By 47, he had a low tolerance for liabilities. "Ray, you heading out?" someone called near the end of shift. He glanced at the clock mounted crookedly above the lockers. 5:05. Close enough. "Yeah," he said, wiping his hands on a rag and folding it with care. "See you tomorrow." The words were automatic. Tomorrow was assumed. Ray had been here since he was 18. Since the summer after he graduated high school and needed a job that paid more than minimum wage and didn't ask too many questions. He had started on the floors, dragging pallets until his shoulders burned, lifting crates until his hands blistered, learning the rhythms of machines the way some people learned music. He never left. The plant changed names twice. Management came and went. People he trained retired, got fired, or disappeared into better opportunities. Ray stayed. He didn't chase titles or advancement. He didn't resist them either. Promotions found him slowly, almost apologetically, as if the company wasn't sure how else to reward someone who never asked for anything. Outside, the evening air was cool and clean. Ray sat in his truck for a moment before turning the key, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. He did this most days, paused between work and whatever came next. A small buffer, a habit he hadn't consciously chosen but now relied on. Home was quiet. It always was. That hadn't always been true. The memory surfaced uninvited, as it often did when he let his mind idle. He saw it again with uncomfortable clarity, the way the house had felt wrong the moment he stepped inside. No music playing. No television murmuring in the background. No voices upstairs. Just space. He had called out, assuming some ordinary explanation. Grocery store. Appointment. Running late. No answer. The kitchen table had been cleared of everything except a single manila envelope. His name was written neatly across the front, the handwriting familiar enough that it took him a moment to understand what he was looking at. Inside were papers, carefully stacked, highlighted in places, legal language dense and impersonal, laying out the end of an 11-year marriage as if it were a scheduling conflict. He remembered standing there longer than made sense, reading the same paragraph over and over, waiting for it to rearrange itself into something he could recognize. There had been no note, no explanation, no argument waiting to happen. She had already left. Ray didn't remember shouting. He didn't remember throwing anything. What he remembered most was the confusion, a bewilderment so complete it bordered on disbelief. There had been no warning signs he could identify in hindsight, no escalating fights, no cold distance. If she had been unhappy, she had kept it to herself with impressive discipline. And if there had been something broken between them, she had never shown him where to look. The anger came later, not the loud kind, the kind that settled in and stayed. It wasn't the marriage ending that did it. Ray had always believed that when someone told you they didn't want you, the correct response was to listen. He had no interest in being begged or bargained with. If leaving was what she wanted, who was he to argue? What he couldn't forgive, what he still struggled to make peace with, was what came next. Custody schedules, weekend visits, for days a month that had once been every day. School events attended like a guest instead of a parent. Phone calls that felt increasingly formal. A slow, steady erosion of familiarity with his own children's lives. He went from knowing which cereal they preferred to asking polite questions about classes he didn't fully understand. From helping with homework to being updated after decisions had already been made. He tried at first. He drove the extra miles. He rearranged his shifts. He showed up early and stayed late. He reached out. But effort, Ray learned, only worked when it was returned. By the time his youngest left for college, something fundamental had shifted. The calls came when they needed something. Money, advice, help moving. He gave what he could because they were his kids and always would be. What he stopped giving was himself. It hadn't been a dramatic decision. No confrontation. No declaration. He simply noticed that he was the only one initiating contact, the only one checking in, the only one trying to keep the thread intact. And when he noticed that, he stopped pulling. Matching energy, he called it, when his brother asked, "You're not cutting them off, are you?" His brother had said, half joking but watching him carefully. "No," Ray had replied. "I'm just not chasing." That rule extended outward, quietly reshaping his life. He didn't volunteer personal details at work. He didn't date. He didn't flirt. When his brother teased him about retiring early from romance, Ray smiled and agreed. The prize, he said, wasn't worth the risk. He turned into his driveway and shut off the engine. The house greeted him with the same stillness he'd grown accustomed to. He liked it this way. There were no surprises waiting inside. No expectations he hadn't agreed to. No conversations that could blindside him. Peace, Ray had learned, didn't require happiness. It required boundaries. He hung his jacket, washed his hands, and stood for a moment in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. Tomorrow would be another shift, another set of pallets, another day of being useful without being seen. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 2, Shelf Life. Ray's phone buzzed on the nightstand at 6:12 a.m., vibrating twice before going still. He didn't reach for it right away. There was a time when any sound from that device would have pulled him awake instantly. Heart jumping, mind already racing through possibilities. School emergency. Missed call from one of the kids. A chance, however small, to matter urgently to someone. That reflex had dulled with age and repetition. He lay there for a moment, staring at the faint crack in the ceiling above his bed, then picked up the phone and glanced at the screen. "Dad, can you Venmo me $200? Bookstore was more expensive than I thought." No greeting. No context beyond the transaction. No acknowledgement of the fact that they hadn't spoken in 3 weeks. Ray exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh. He set the phone back down, swung his legs over the side of the bed, and stood. The floor was cold. The house was quiet. The request sat where it was, unanswered. He wasn't angry. That surprised people when he tried to explain it. Anger would have been easier, louder, more satisfying. This was something flatter. A recognition. He showered, dressed, and made coffee, moving through the morning with practiced efficiency. By the time he sat at the small kitchen table, mug warming his hands, he picked the phone back up. He sent the money. He always did. Sent, he typed. Nothing else. The 3 dots never appeared. Ray finished his coffee and rinsed the mug. This was the rhythm now. Contact that came attached to a need. Silence the rest of the time. He had spent years trying to bridge that gap. Calls left unanswered. Texts that drifted into nothing. Invitations declined with vague apologies. At some point, the effort began to feel like a performance no one was watching. He had noticed it slowly, the way you noticed a room cooling when someone opened a door. The imbalance. The way he was the one initiating every exchange, asking questions that weren't returned, offering updates that went unacknowledged. When the realization finally settled in, it hadn't been dramatic. It had been almost clinical. So he stopped. Not the money. Not the help when it was asked for. He stopped the chasing. Stopped reminding. Stopped trying to manufacture closeness out of habit and obligation. Matching energy. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't withdrawal. It was calibration. At work, the day passed as days usually did. Tasks completed. Words exchanged only when necessary. Ray liked the predictability. Machines behaved according to rules. People did not. His brother, Mark, called during Ray's lunch break. "You alive?" Mark asked by way of greeting. Ray smiled faintly. "Last I checked." "Good. I'm stopping by tonight." "Don't argue." "I wasn't planning to." Mark snorted. "That's what worries me." They hung up, and Ray returned to work without thinking much about it. Mark had always been like that, decisive, intrusive in the way only someone who loved you could get away with. They were close without being tangled. Mark had seen the worst of the divorce fallout, had watched Ray recalibrate his entire life without making a spectacle of it. If anyone understood the boundaries, it was Mark. That evening, Mark showed up with takeout and an opinion, as usual. He kicked off his shoes by the door like he still lived there and set the food on the counter. "You look the same," Mark said, surveying Ray. "That's either a compliment or a cry for help." Ray shrugged. "I slept." They ate at the kitchen table, the same one that had once held a neatly stacked envelope that changed everything. Ray had considered replacing it years ago. He never did. Mark wiped his mouth and leaned back. "So, you didn't call your daughter back?" Ray didn't bother pretending surprise. "She didn't call me. She texted. She requested money." Mark held up a hand. "Fair." They sat in silence for a moment, the comfortable kind that didn't demand filling. "I worry about you," Mark said finally, not accusatory, just honest. "You've made your world real small." Ray considered that. "It's the right size. For now." "For now," Ray agreed. Mark studied him. "You're not shutting them out, are you?" Ray met his brother's gaze. "No. I'm just not dragging myself into their lives when they don't make room. That sounds like a speech. It's not. It's math. Mark laughed softly. Matching energy. Exactly. And romance? Mark asked, grinning. Still retired? Ray snorted. Early retirement. Great benefits. No stress. Coward. Peaceful. Ray corrected. Mark didn't push. He never did. That was the difference between concern and interference. They talked about work, about their parents, about nothing that mattered too much. When Mark left, Ray felt the familiar relief of solitude settle back into place. Later, alone again, Ray stood at the sink washing dishes, watching the water run over his hands. He thought about the way his life had narrowed. Not collapsed, not failed, just focused. He hadn't lost everything. He still had his job, his health, his brother, his sense of self. What he had lost was the illusion that effort alone could secure permanence. That illusion had cost him years. His phone buzzed again just before bed. Thanks, his daughter finally texted. Ray stared at the word for a moment, then set the phone face down on the nightstand. Tomorrow would come. It always did. And he would meet it the same way he met everything now. Steady, quiet, giving no more than was asked, and nothing less than respect required. For the first time in a long while, that felt like enough. Chapter 3, the temporary office. The first sign that something was wrong was the clipboard. Ray had just finished securing a pallet when he noticed it sitting on his workstation. Blue plastic, cracked at the corner. His name written across the top in a supervisor's careful block letters. He stared at it for a moment, then looked up and down the line, as if it might belong to someone else who had wandered off and would come back for it. No such luck. Ray. He turned. Frank Miller was standing a few feet away, rubbing at his shoulder with a wince that suggested it had been bothering him longer than he was willing to admit. You busy? Frank asked, already knowing the answer. Ray glanced at the line. Everything was running smoothly. I can be. Frank nodded, relief flashing across his face. Good. I need you up front for a bit. Ray frowned. Up front how long? Frank hesitated. Couple weeks. Maybe longer. That earned a longer look. Why? Frank shifted his weight. Doctor says I shouldn't be lifting. HR wants me doing paperwork until I'm cleared. Which means I need someone who knows the floor to keep the admin side from going completely off the rails. Ray looked back at the conveyor belt, then at the clipboard. You want me in the office? Temporary, Frank said quickly. Just coverage. Ray didn't say no right away. He rarely did. But this wasn't dragging a pallet or covering a shift. This was visibility. What kind of paperwork? Ray asked. Frank smiled, clearly relieved he hadn't refused outright. Schedules, inventory reports, coordination with logistics, mostly making sure what's on paper matches what's actually happening out here. Ray considered that. It was practical, useful. It didn't require small talk, at least not in theory. When? He asked. Frank gestured toward the clipboard. Now. The office was smaller than Ray expected. 2 desks, a filing cabinet that had seen better decades, and a window that looked out over the floor like a reminder of where he belonged. He took the chair closest to the door by instinct. This is temporary, Frank said again, hovering. I know you like your routine. Ray nodded. I like things that work. They'll still work, Frank promised. Just louder. As if summoned by the word, the door opened. Frank, I've got the updated shipping. Oh. The woman who stopped short in the doorway took in the scene quickly. Ray seated stiffly at the desk, Frank mid-hover, the clipboard like a prop in a play no one had rehearsed. I didn't realize we were doing introductions, she said. Her tone wasn't apologetic. It was amused. Frank cleared his throat. Ray, this is Lena Morales. She's temporarily stuck here, Lena finished, stepping inside and setting a thick folder on the other desk. Against my better judgment. Ray stood. Old habit. Ray Kitts. She shook his hand, grip firm, eyes sharp. Nice to meet you, Ray Kitts. She didn't let go immediately, which threw him off just enough that he noticed. Then she released him and dropped into her chair, already flipping open the folder. Frank looked between them. Lena's handling coordination with corporate. She's the reason half this paperwork exists. Because corporate likes numbers, Lena said without looking up. And because people on the floor hate filling out forms. Ray sat back down slowly. I don't hate forms. Lena glanced up at him, eyebrow lifting. We'll see. Frank clapped his hands together. Great. You two will get along fine. I'm gonna go ice my shoulder and pretend this was all my idea. When the door closed behind him, the office settled into an unfamiliar quiet. Quieter than the floor, louder than Ray preferred. Lena slid a stack of papers across the desk toward him. Okay, Ray Kitts, tell me what's wrong with these numbers. Ray looked at the papers. He didn't touch them right away. What makes you think something's wrong? Experience, she said lightly. And the fact that corporate thinks you can move 30% more product without adding hours. Ray finally picked up the stack, scanning it. They're counting theoretical capacity, not actual flow. Lena smiled, sharp and satisfied. Exactly. He flipped through another page. They're also assuming no downtime for maintenance. Which would be adorable if it weren't ridiculous, she said. Ray set the papers down. I can fix it. I was hoping you'd say that. They worked in silence for a while, the productive kind. Ray annotated margins. Lena typed. When they compared notes, they found they were already aligned. You've been here how long? She asked eventually. Since high school. That explains it, she said. You see the place as it is, not as it looks on a spreadsheet. Ray shrugged. Machines don't lie. People do. Lena laughed, surprised. I like you. He didn't respond to that. Compliments made him uneasy, especially casual ones. After a pause, she added, You don't talk much. I talk when there's something to say. She considered that. Fair. By mid-afternoon, Ray realized something else was wrong. People were stopping by the office. They leaned in the doorway, asked questions, cracked jokes. Ray answered efficiently, redirecting them back to their tasks. Lena, meanwhile, engaged easily, quick comments, dry humor, an ease Ray recognized but did not share. When one of the line supervisors lingered too long, Lena cleared her throat pointedly. Unless you've suddenly developed a passion for inventory reconciliation, I suggest you move along. The supervisor grinned and left. Ray watched her. You don't mind being direct. I mind being ignored more, she said. I avoid both. She laughed again, softer this time. You're an interesting man, Ray Kitts. The day ended with a headache Ray hadn't anticipated. Not from noise, but from attention. As he gathered his things, Lena watched him. You okay? She asked. He nodded. Just not used to sitting still. Tomorrow, she said. We'll stand more. He paused at the door. This is temporary. I know, she said, meeting his gaze. Most things are. Ray left with the uneasy sense that something had shifted. Not dramatically. Not yet. But the office behind him felt less like an assignment and more like an interruption. And Ray had built his life carefully to avoid those. Chapter 4, Unwanted Visibility. By the third day in the office, Ray understood the problem. It wasn't the paperwork. That was manageable, logical, linear, honest in a way people rarely were. Numbers either matched reality or they didn't. If they didn't, Ray corrected them. No ambiguity. No subtext. It was the fact that people now knew where to find him. The office had become a waypoint. A place where questions were asked instead of solved. Where people stopped by just for a second and stayed for 10 minutes. Leaning in the doorway like the threshold itself invited conversation. Ray hated thresholds. He arrived early, hoping to get ahead of the interruptions. The plant floor was still warming up, machines ticking and groaning like they were stretching awake. He liked that hour, the quiet before the noise settled in permanently. Lena was already there. She sat at her desk with her shoes kicked off, feet tucked under her chair, a mug balanced precariously near the edge. She looked up when he entered, eyes bright. You're early, she said. So are you, Ray replied. She smiled. I'm trying something radical. Which is? Leaving on time later. Ray set his lunch in the mini fridge and hung his jacket. Good luck. She laughed. I see you're an optimist. They worked in parallel for a while, the quiet punctuated by the distant hum of the floor. Ray found himself aware of her presence in an unfamiliar way, not distracting exactly, but present. She hummed occasionally, tuneless but content, stopped when she noticed him glance over. Sorry, she said. Habit. It's fine, Ray replied. And it was. He surprised himself by meaning it. The first interruption came at 8:30, then another at 8:45. By 9, Ray had answered the same question 3 different ways to 3 different people. After the fourth, Lena leaned back in her chair and said, loudly enough to be heard down the hall, Ray is not a vending machine. Please stop shaking him to see what comes out. There was a beat of silence, then a laugh. Footsteps retreated. Ray stared at her. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, she said, unapologetic. You were going to keep answering until your soul left your body. I don't mind answering. You do, she said. You just don't complain. He didn't argue. She was right, and that irritated him more than if she'd been wrong. Late morning brought a meeting request from corporate. A video call. Ray's stomach tightened as soon as he saw the calendar invite. I don't do calls, he said flatly. Lena glanced at the screen. You do today. He frowned. Why? Because they're asking questions about throughput that only you can answer. I wrote it all down. They want tone, she said. Confidence. Reassurance. Ray crossed his arms. I'm not reassuring anyone. She studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay, then don't reassure them. Just tell the truth. That usually doesn't go well. It does if you let it, she said. And I'll be there. That gave him pause. He wasn't used to anyone volunteering to stand next to him in a room where he didn't belong. The call itself was mercifully short. Ray answered precisely without embellishment. He didn't smile. He didn't soften his language. He told them what was possible and what wasn't and why. When it ended, Lena exhaled. That was impressive. He shrugged. They asked. They usually push back. They didn't. They didn't, she agreed, smiling. You're like a human boundary. Ray didn't know how to respond to that. By lunchtime, the headache had arrived. A dull pressure behind his eyes, the kind that came from being watched too closely for too long. He ate quickly at his desk, avoiding the break room. Lena watched him over her salad. You okay? Fine. You say that like it's a habit. It is. She didn't push. Instead, she said, walk with me. Where? Nowhere important. He hesitated, then stood. They walked the perimeter of the floor, staying just out of the way of the machines. Lena greeted people easily, remembered names, cracked jokes. Ray nodded when spoken to, kept his hands in his pockets. Does this bother you? She asked quietly, as they passed a cluster of workers laughing near the loading dock. Yes, he said without hesitation. She smiled slightly. Good. I'd be worried if it didn't. He glanced at her. Why? Because then you'd be pretending. They stopped near the far wall, where the noise softened and the air smelled faintly of oil and dust. You don't like being seen, she said. Not accusing, just observant. I don't like being misunderstood. That's different. Not by much. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You know, most people would kill for this. Being the guy everyone relies on. I don't want to be relied on, Ray said. I want to be respected. Lena considered that. You can be both. He shook his head. Reliance turns into expectation. Expectation turns into disappointment. And you've had enough of that. The words landed gently, but precisely. Ray didn't ask how she knew. He didn't deny it either. Back in the office, the afternoon passed more quietly. People seemed to take Lena's earlier comments seriously. Ray finished his work early and stared at the screen, restless. You could leave, Lena said, noticing. You're not chained here. I know. But you won't. No, she smiled. Why not? He thought about it. Because if I do, they'll need me later. And that matters to you. It matters that things don't fall apart. She nodded. You're the glue. I'm the spare part, Ray corrected. You only notice me when something breaks. Lena looked at him for a long moment. That's not how I see you. He didn't respond. Compliments still made him uneasy, especially ones that suggested he was more than he intended to be. As the day wound down, Lena gathered her things. Same time tomorrow? She asked. This is temporary, Ray reminded her. She smiled, unoffended. Most things are. He left the plant with the headache still humming, but something else had joined it. A sense of displacement he couldn't quite name. The office had made him visible in ways he hadn't planned for. Lena had noticed things he preferred to keep unnoticed. At home, the quiet felt different. Not better or worse, just louder in its absence. Ray stood in the kitchen, listening to nothing, and realized with a flicker of unease that he had spent the entire day being seen. And part of him hadn't hated it. Chapter 5, retired early, Ray ran into Lena Morales in the most unromantic way possible. He was standing in the hardware store on a Wednesday evening, staring at an aisle of light bulbs as if one of them might confess which wattage would finally stop the flicker in his hallway. He had already picked the wrong kind twice. The receipt clerk had started greeting him with sympathy. Unless you're planning to interrogate them, a voice said behind him. They're not going to volunteer. Ray turned, mildly startled. Lena stood a few feet away, holding a basket with paint samples, a roll of blue painter's tape, and a screwdriver that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. He blinked once. You don't work here. Devastating, I know. She smiled. You look like a man who's losing an argument with household lighting. I just wanted to stop blinking. Warm light or daylight? She asked. Whichever doesn't mock me. Daylight it is, she said, plucking a box off the shelf and handing it to him. Trust me. He took it, still slightly off balance. You shop here often? Often enough to pretend I know what I'm doing, she said. You? Only when something breaks. That tracks. They stood there for a moment, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the pause. Ray became uncomfortably aware that this was not work. There was no clipboard, no shared task, no excuse. So, Lena said easily, is this where you pretend you don't see me and escape? Ray considered that. I thought about it. Honesty. I appreciate that. They walked toward the registers together, not quite side by side, but close enough that people might assume intention. Ray didn't correct the assumption. Outside, the evening air was cool. Lena gestured toward the small cafe across the parking lot. Coffee? He hesitated. Reflex. Then he surprised himself. All right. The cafe was quiet, half full with people lingering over laptops and half-finished conversations. They took a small table by the window. Ray wrapped his hands around the mug when it arrived, grounding himself in the heat. This is unexpected, he said. Running into me? She asked. No. Saying yes. She smiled. Not triumphantly, just pleased. Good unexpected or bad? Neutral, he said. Undecided. I'll take neutral. They talked the way people do when there's no script, about the plant, about the absurdity of corporate emails sent at midnight, about the way time felt different once you passed 40. The conversation moved easily, without the forced cheerfulness Ray associated with dating. At one point, Lena said, You don't ask many questions. I listen, he replied. That counts, she said. Most people are just waiting to talk again. She told him about her transfer, about leaving a job that paid well but demanded more than she was willing to give. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't frame herself as a victim or a hero. She just stated facts. I burned out, she said. Decided I liked my life more than my resume. Ray nodded. That makes sense. She studied him. What about you? He took a sip of coffee. What about me? Why you're like this, she said, not unkindly. He almost laughed. Like what? Careful, she said. Contained. He considered his answer, choosing honesty without excess. I retired early. From what? Romance. Her eyebrows lifted. That's young for retirement. I had a good run, he said dryly. She didn't challenge him. That surprised him. Instead, she said, did you like it? Sometimes. And sometimes not enough to try again. Exactly. They sat with that. Outside, a car passed slowly, headlights sweeping across the window. I'm not asking you to unretire, Lena said eventually. Just so we're clear. That's good, Ray said. Because I'm not taking applications. She laughed. Fair. When they left, they walked to their cars together. There was no awkward pause, no forced escalation. Just a shared moment that ended naturally. See you tomorrow, she said. This is temporary, Ray reminded her. She smiled. I know. At home, Ray replaced the light bulb. The hallway filled with steady, unblinking light. He stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then turned it off. Later, lying in bed, he realized something unsettling. He hadn't felt the need to protect himself all evening. And that, more than attraction, more than humor or coincidence, was what kept him awake longer than usual. Staring at the ceiling, wondering when neutral had started to feel like something more. Chapter 6, Fault Lines. The first crack appeared on a Thursday afternoon, thin and easy to miss. Ray was halfway through reconciling a shipment discrepancy when his phone buzzed on the desk. He didn't usually keep it out at work, but the office had a way of blurring lines he preferred to keep sharp. He glanced down, expecting nothing urgent. Dad, are you busy? The message was from his son, which immediately put Ray on edge. Busy was relative. Busy meant different things to different people. For his kids, it often meant available if I push. He waited a minute before replying. Then another. He finished the line he was working on, saved the document, and finally typed back. I'm at work. What's up? The reply came almost instantly. I need a favor. Ray closed his eyes briefly. There it was. Not how are you, not do you have a minute. Just the pivot straight to need. Lena looked up from her screen. Everything okay? Yeah, Ray said automatically, then stopped. He corrected himself. No, but it's not urgent. She nodded, accepting that without prying. He appreciated that more than he would have admitted. The favor, it turned out, was logistical. His son needed help moving some furniture over the weekend. Short notice. Very short notice. Ray was already scheduled for overtime on Saturday, covering for a machine maintenance window that had been pushed back twice. I can't this weekend, Ray typed. I'm working. There was a pause. Longer this time. You always say that, came the reply. The words sat heavier than they should have. Ray stared at them, feeling the familiar urge to explain himself rise up, and the equally familiar decision to suppress it. I've worked Saturdays for 25 years, he typed. This isn't new. Another pause. Okay, never mind. No argument. No guilt trip. Just a clean withdrawal that somehow stung more than confrontation would have. Ray set the phone face down and returned to his work, but the numbers blurred. The crack widened. Later that afternoon, Frank stopped by the office, arm still in a sling. Corporate loved the updated projections, he said. They want more. Ray didn't look up. More what? More efficiency. More output. More reporting. Without more people. Frank grimaced. You know how it is. Ray knew exactly how it was. This was the part where expectations crept in quietly and settled like dust, unnoticed until you tried to breathe. They're scheduling a review next week, Frank continued. They want you there. Ray finally looked at him. This is temporary. I know, Frank said quickly. But you're already doing the job. That was the problem. Ray didn't say it out loud, but he felt it. Doing the job meant owning the consequences. It meant being relied on. After Frank left, Ray sat back, rubbing at his temple. The headache had returned, sharper now, edged with irritation. You're spiraling, Lena said mildly. He looked at her. I am not. You are, she said, unbothered. Your jaw does that thing when you're annoyed but pretending you're not. I don't have a thing, she smiled. You absolutely do. He exhaled, conceding the point without words. What's going on? She asked. He hesitated. Old instinct urged him to deflect, to keep the line clean. But the office had made that harder. Proximity had a way of inviting honesty. My kids, he said finally. And work. Same issue, different packaging. People wanting more than you agreed to give. Yes. She nodded slowly. That's familiar. He glanced at her. From where? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, eyes on the ceiling. I was with someone for 8 years, she said. We didn't fight much. We were very functional. Ray waited. I did most of the adjusting, she continued. Most of the anticipating. I was good at it. So good that he stopped trying. That sounds exhausting. It was, she said. But quietly. No explosions. Just erosion. Ray felt a flicker of recognition he didn't entirely welcome. When it ended, Lena went on. People asked what went wrong. I never had a satisfying answer. Nothing went wrong. It just stopped being right. Ray nodded once. He understood that kind of ending. The kind that didn't give you a villain. The misunderstanding came later, subtle and entirely unplanned. Ray stayed late to finish a report, lost track of time. By the time he shut down his computer, the office was empty. Lena's desk was cleared, her chair pushed in. He felt an unexpected pang of disappointment, immediately annoyed with himself for noticing. At home, his phone buzzed again. A message from Lena. I waited for you. Figured you left. He stared at the screen, heart ticking a little faster. Got pulled into finishing something, he typed. Didn't think you'd still be there. There was a delay before her response. Okay, just that. No emoji. No follow-up. Ray read into it despite himself. He told himself he was projecting, that he was imagining disappointment where there was none. But the old reflex kicked in, the one that assumed loss before it could happen. The next day, he was distant. Polite, efficient, but closed. Lena noticed. Of course she did. You're pulling back, she said at lunch. Not accusing, just observant. I'm fine. She studied him. You don't get to decide that for me. That stopped him. I'm not. You are, she said. You're deciding what I'll think, how I'll react, and adjusting accordingly. Ray felt his defenses rise. I'm just keeping things professional. This is a plant, Ray. Not a monastery. He didn't smile. I don't want misunderstandings. Then talk to me, she said. Don't disappear. Disappear. The word hit closer to home than she knew. He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because every answer felt like risk. By the end of the day, the crack had widened into something harder to ignore. Ray drove home in silence, the radio off, the road familiar beneath him. He had built his life to withstand pressure by keeping it small, controlled, predictable. But fault lines, he knew, didn't announce themselves until something shifted. And something had. He stood in his kitchen, phone in hand, looking at the unread message notification from Lena that had arrived while he was driving. Ray didn't open it. Not yet. He told himself he was protecting the balance he'd worked so hard to achieve. He told himself this was what matching energy looked like. But as he set the phone down and turned off the light, a quieter thought followed him into the dark. Maybe this time he wasn't matching energy at all. Maybe he was retreating. Chapter 7. Energy Mismatch. Ray knew something was wrong before Lena said a word. It was the quiet. Not the comfortable, shared quiet they had settled into during the first week in the office, but a brittle version of it. The kind that held its breath. Lena worked steadily at her desk, efficient and focused, but she didn't hum. She didn't glance over when Ray shifted in his chair. When someone stopped by the office with a question, she handled it herself instead of looping Ray in the way she usually did. Ray told himself he appreciated the space. By mid-morning, that lie had worn thin. You're doing it again, Lena said without looking up. Ray paused, pen hovering over the page. Doing what? She finally turned her chair toward him. Deciding. Deciding what? What this is. How I feel. Where this goes. She folded her arms, expression calm but intent. You've pulled back. And before you tell me you're just being professional, save it. He set the pen down carefully. I don't want things to get complicated. They already are, she said. You just don't like acknowledging it. Ray leaned back, crossing his arms. The familiar defensive posture felt too easy. I'm trying to avoid misunderstandings. No, Lena said gently. You're trying to avoid disappointment. The words landed with uncomfortable accuracy. You don't know that, he said. I do, she replied. Because I do the same thing. Or I used to. He studied her, searching for judgment and finding none. That made it harder. You decide in advance how people will fail you, she continued. Then you adjust your behavior so it hurts less when it happens. Ray's jaw tightened. That's not fair. Isn't it? She asked. You didn't read my message last night. He didn't deny it. I needed time. You didn't ask for it, she said. You just disappeared. Disappear. Again. Ray exhaled slowly. I didn't want to assume you were upset. So you assumed I would be, she countered. And acted accordingly. He looked away, toward the window overlooking the floor. The machines moved with relentless consistency. He trusted that. I've had enough surprises, he said quietly. Lena's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. So have I. That doesn't mean we stop showing up. I am showing up, Ray said. I'm here. You're present, she corrected. You're not engaged. He turned back to her. What do you want from me? The question came out sharper than he intended. He regretted it immediately. Lena didn't flinch. Honesty. Not the trimmed-down version. Not the preemptive retreat. Just honesty. Ray was silent for a long moment. The office felt smaller, the walls closer. I don't trust permanence, he said finally. I don't trust that effort equals return. I've learned that if you give more than people ask for, they get comfortable taking it. That's true sometimes, Lena said. And sometimes it's just an excuse to never risk wanting more. He looked at her sharply. I'm not asking you to overextend, she continued. I'm asking you not to disappear the moment something feels uncertain. Ray shook his head. You make it sound simple. I didn't say easy. The door opened briefly. Someone poked their head in, sensed the tension, and retreated without speaking. The office fell quiet again. You know what matching energy can turn into? Lena asked. Ray didn't answer. Withdrawal, she said. Punishing people for not giving what they don't know you want. I don't punish, Ray said. No, she agreed. You just step back so far no one can reach you. That stung because it was true. Ray stood, needing to move. He crossed to the window, hands braced on the sill. I spent years trying to keep things together, he said. Trying harder than anyone else. And when it ended without warning. No discussion. No chance to fix anything. His voice tightened. I don't do well with silent exits. Lena stood too, but she didn't approach him. She gave him space. Then don't recreate them. He turned, surprised. You're doing the same thing, she said. Leaving emotionally before anyone else can. Ray swallowed. What if I stay and it still ends? She met his gaze. Then at least it ends honestly. The truth of that settled heavily between them. I'm not asking you to promise anything, Lena said. I'm asking you to stop deciding for me that I'll eventually walk away. Ray felt something inside him shift, unsettled, exposed. I don't know how to do this differently, he admitted. That's okay, she said. Just don't do it alone. The conversation didn't resolve everything. It didn't magically erase years of habit. But when Lena returned to her desk and Ray sat back down at his, something fundamental had changed. The crack was still there. But now, instead of retreating from it, Ray could see it clearly. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't immediately step back. Chapter 8, showing up. Ray made the decision on a Saturday morning, standing in the break room at work with a burnt cup of coffee and a schedule taped crookedly to the wall. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No music swelled. No internal monologue announced itself with certainty. He simply noticed that the familiar justification, the one that told him to keep his head down, to let things resolve themselves without his involvement, didn't feel as convincing as it used to. The maintenance window had gone long. It always did. Ray moved between stations, checking on progress, answering questions before they were fully formed. People looked to him now without hesitation. That too had changed. Around 10, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He almost ignored it. Almost. He stepped away from the noise and checked the screen. Hey Dad, any chance you're free later? I could use help. Not money, just help. Ray stared at the words longer than necessary. No immediate ask. No assumption. Just an opening. He typed back before he could talk himself out of it. I'm working until 2. What do you need? The reply came slower this time, careful. Moving some stuff out of storage. It's fine if you can't. Ray thought about the overtime. About how easy it would be to say no. About how often he had defaulted to that because it was safer, cleaner, less complicated. I can be there after, he typed. Send me the address. He felt the decision settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, but resolve. He showed up. The storage unit was smaller than Ray expected, cluttered but manageable. His son looked surprised when he arrived, then quietly relieved. They worked side by side, not talking much at first. Ray didn't fill the silence. He didn't rush it. Eventually, his son said, "Thanks for coming." Ray nodded. "You asked." Something eased between them, not fixed, not healed, but less brittle. Later, driving home, Ray realized something else. He hadn't calculated whether the effort would be returned. He had just given it. That evening, he stood in his kitchen, phone in hand, staring at Lena's name. This time, he didn't wait. "Can we talk?" He typed. The response came quickly. Yes. They met at the same cafe as before, the familiarity grounding rather than loaded. Lena arrived first, already seated, fingers wrapped around her mug. She looked up when he approached, expression open but guarded. Ray didn't waste time. "I'm bad at this," he said, sitting down. "At the part where you don't retreat the moment something feels like it could matter." Lena listened. She always did. "I realized I use boundaries as armor," he continued. "And sometimes that's necessary. But sometimes, it's just fear with better language." She smiled faintly. "That's very self-aware of you. I'm not proud of it. You don't have to be." He met her eyes. "I don't want to disappear on you. I don't want to decide for you how this ends." Lena considered him for a moment. "I don't need guarantees, Ray. I just need presence." "I can do that," he said. Then, "Honest, I think That's enough to start. They didn't define anything that night. They didn't promise more than they could give. They talked about work, about boundaries, about the strange courage it took to keep showing up after disappointment. When they parted, there was warmth instead of tension. Intention instead of avoidance. At home, Ray turned on the hallway light. It glowed steady and reliable. He left it on longer than necessary, then sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had once held an ending. This time it held something else. Not certainty, not permanence, a choice. And for the first time in a long while, Ray didn't step back from it. Chapter 9. A larger life. Ray's life didn't change all at once. That surprised him, given how often people talked about turning points as if they arrived with banners and instructions. What actually happened was quieter, subtler. A series of small decisions that didn't announce themselves as growth until he looked back and realized he was standing somewhere new. The temporary assignment ended on a Monday. Frank returned to the floor with a sheepish grin and a shoulder that still wasn't right but no longer in a sling. Ray handed over the clipboard without ceremony. "Appreciate it," Frank said. "You kept the place running." Ray nodded. "That was the job." Frank hesitated, then added, "Doors open if you ever want it." Ray knew what he meant. A title. Permanent office. More visibility. "I know," Ray said. "Thanks." He went back to Line C that afternoon. The hum of the machines felt familiar, grounding. People greeted him the same way they always had, with nods, quick jokes, requests delivered without flourish. He fit back into the rhythm easily, but not completely. He noticed things now. How often people checked the office window even when he wasn't there. How his absence left small pauses that hadn't existed before. He was still quiet, still private. He just wasn't invisible anymore. Lena stopped by the floor near the end of his shift, hard hat slightly askew, tablet tucked under her arm. "So this is where you disappear to," she said. "I told you," Ray replied. "Temporary." She smiled. "Everything is." They walked out together, not touching, not rushing. There was no urgency between them. No sense of borrowed time. Just choice made again and again. They didn't label what they were doing. They had dinner sometimes, coffee more often. They talked about work when it mattered and avoided it when it didn't. Lena didn't try to pry Ray open. Ray didn't ration himself as carefully as he once had. One evening, sitting on opposite ends of his couch with takeout containers balanced precariously, Lena said, "You know you don't have to earn being here." Ray considered that. "I know. Do you?" He smiled faintly. "I'm learning." His kids noticed the difference before he did. The calls didn't suddenly multiply. The dynamic didn't reverse itself overnight. But when Ray showed up now, he stayed present instead of bracing for disappointment. He listened without anticipating the exit. When he couldn't help, he said so plainly. When he could, he didn't attach conditions. One Sunday afternoon, his daughter called just to talk. No request attached. Ray leaned against the kitchen counter, phone warm in his hand, listening to her describe a class she loved and one she hated. When the call ended, he stood there for a long moment, stunned by how ordinary, and how rare, it felt. He didn't read into it. He didn't demand more. He just accepted it. That night, Ray sat at the kitchen table, the same one that had once marked the quiet end of a life he hadn't known was ending. He traced a groove in the wood with his thumb and thought about how much meaning he'd given that moment over the years. It had been an ending, yes, but it hadn't been the whole story. Lena came over later, kicked off her shoes, and wandered into the kitchen like she belonged there. Not possessive, not tentative, just present. "You're thinking again," she said. He smiled. "I do that. Dangerous habit." Apparently, she leaned against the counter across from him. "You okay?" Ray met her gaze. He didn't deflect. He didn't soften the truth to make it safer. "Yes," he said. "I am." She smiled, not wide, not triumphant. Just content. They stood there in the quiet, no rush to fill it. Ray realized then that the peace he'd been guarding so fiercely hadn't been threatened by connection. It had been limited by it. He still believed in boundaries, still believed in matching energy. But he understood now that matching didn't always mean withdrawing. Sometimes it meant stepping forward when the other person did, and trusting that they meant it. Ray Kitts was still a quiet man at the end of the line. He still worked hard, still kept his private life private, still valued peace over noise, intention over impulse. But his life was no longer small. It had room now for choice, for presence, for the possibility that showing up didn't always mean getting hurt. Sometimes it just meant being there. And this time, Ray stayed. Chapter 10. Matching, rewritten. Ray didn't notice the change right away. That wasn't modesty or denial, it was consistency. His days still began the same way. Early mornings, coffee brewed strong enough to taste like resolve. A house that greeted him with silence he no longer mistook for absence. He still drove the same route to work. Still parked in the same spot. Still took pride in doing his job well without announcing it. What changed was how much of himself he allowed to arrive with him. It showed up first in small, unremarkable moments. A coworker asked how his weekend had been, and Ray answered honestly instead of deflecting. Not expansively, not performatively, just truthfully. Helped his son install a shelf without calculating how long it had been since they'd last spoken. Let his daughter's voicemail sit for an hour because he was busy, not because he was bracing himself. Matching energy, he realized, didn't require preemptive withdrawal. Sometimes it required patience. The manufacturing plant adjusted easily to Frank's return. Ray slipped back into his familiar role without friction. The office no longer claimed him, but the knowledge that it existed, available, offered rather than imposed, shifted something inside him. He didn't resent being useful anymore. One afternoon, Lena met him outside the plant at the end of his shift, leaning against her car, tablet tucked under her arm like punctuation. "You look tired," she said. "I am," Ray replied. She smiled. "Good tired or bad tired?" He considered. "Earned. I'll take that." They drove separately to a small diner a few miles away, the kind of place that hadn't changed its menu in decades and didn't feel the need to. Ray liked that. Continuity without stagnation. Over burgers and fries, Lena told him she'd been offered a permanent position, one that came with more responsibility and a longer commute. "I haven't said yes," she said. Ray didn't react immediately. He didn't brace himself or search for implications. He just listened. "What do you want?" he asked. She smiled softly. "That's new." "What?" "You asking without assuming the answer." Ray nodded once. "I'm trying. I want the work," she said. "I don't want the burnout. And I don't want to build a life that only makes sense on paper." "That sounds familiar." She met his gaze. "It should." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need managing. "I'm not asking you to plan around me," Lena added. "I just didn't want to decide alone." Ray felt the weight of that, not obligation but inclusion. "I'm glad you told me," he said. Later, walking her to her car, Lena stopped and turned toward him. "You know," she said, "you don't flinch anymore." Ray frowned slightly. "I don't." "No," she said. "Not when things get real. You pause. You think. But you stay." He thought about that on the drive home, the road familiar beneath him, the radio off. He hadn't noticed the absence of flinching because it had once been reflex. Automatic. Protective. Letting go of it felt less like courage and more like trust, slow, deliberate, earned. That night, Ray sat at the kitchen table again. It had become a place of reflection rather than reckoning. The envelope was long gone. The memory remained, but it no longer owned the space. He thought about the man he'd been when he came home to an empty house and unanswered questions. How quickly he'd learned to make himself smaller. How carefully he'd curated a life that couldn't surprise him. He hadn't been wrong to protect himself. He had just stayed there too long. The next morning, his daughter texted him a photo. Her standing beside a half-finished project, paint smudged on her cheek. "Thought you'd appreciate this," the message read. Ray smiled and replied without hesitation. "Looks like progress." It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It didn't erase years of distance, but it was something offered freely, without leverage or expectation. Ray accepted it the same way. Weeks passed. Lena accepted the job with conditions. Fewer late nights. Clear boundaries. She told Ray first, not because she needed approval, but because she wanted him to know. They didn't move in together. They didn't rush declarations or define timelines. They chose each other in ways that were quiet but unmistakable. One evening, as they walked through Ray's neighborhood, Lena said, "You still believe in matching energy, don't you?" "Yes," Ray said. "Just not as a shield." She smiled. "What is it now?" "A measure," he said after a moment. "A way to notice when something's mutual instead of assumed. And when it's not, then I decide what to do," Ray said. "Not what to avoid." She reached for his hand. Not urgently, not possessively. He took it without thinking. At home, Ray turned on the hallway light. It no longer flickered. He left it on as they passed beneath it, not because he needed reassurance, but because he liked the warmth. Later, lying in bed, Ray stared at the ceiling. The same crack, the same quiet. But the quiet felt different now. Not like something withheld. Like space. Ray Kitts was still a private man. Still careful. Still quiet at the end of the line. But he no longer confused caution with absence. He had learned that boundaries didn't have to mean distance. That peace didn't require isolation. That matching energy wasn't about retreating. It was about recognizing when something met him halfway and choosing, deliberately, to stay. And this time, when life made room for him, Ray stepped into it.